Hello, I'm Darren Grimes and welcome to Reasoned UK, the channel that asks you to think more and follow less. I've got some fantastic guests lined up today, but we also have a fantastic lineup in general, so do consider subscribing and hitting that little notification bell as well to make sure that you don't miss out on any future updates. Now, on today's show, I want to explore the heated debate around transgenderism and self-identification, with some calling for reforms that would remove women from the Equality Act. I've invited two trans women, one from the left and one from the right of politics, to discuss beyond the much repeated line of trans women are women. I want to explore what that actually means in policy terms, or what it should mean in policy terms. And with the ambiguous use of women in relation to sex and gender, is it important that in some areas of our lives we sex segregate? And should it ever be acceptable for children uncomfortable in their own bodies as teens to be placed on generally irreversible hormones and treatments? Anyway, that's enough from me. Let's roll the tape. So joining me to discuss today is Dr. Debbie Hayton, a physics teacher and trade unionist, and Rose of Dawn, a YouTuber who explores and critiques the modern trans community and trans activism. Hello to both of you.
Hey.
Hello, Darren.
Right, I'm going to go in straight with the heavy stuff, actually, if you don't mind. I want to ask quite a personal question to begin with, if I can be so bold, but feel free to tell me to bugger off. I'd like to ask what it's like to actually experience gender dysphoria, and perhaps if you could explain that to my audience, what gender dysphoria is, for one.
I'd probably describe it as an insatiable need to transition. And the hardest thing at the time is you really don't understand why you need to do that, because it just doesn't make any sense. Rationally, you can think, well, I can do everything I can as a man that I could, as a woman. So what is this actually driving me? And without knowledge and without understanding of this, the urge is just there to actually present in the same way as a woman and interact in society in the same way as a woman, and not have a clue about why that's so important to you, and the impact on your mental health of having such a desperate need but being unable to properly explain it is just enormous.
Rose, could you give a brief overview of your view?
Yeah, so one of the difficult things about talking about gender dysphoria is I think it's something which is even hard to understand for people who are fully versed in the kind of the trans political debate. The easiest way that I would describe it is that you feel as though you're, like, the way in which you see yourself, the way in which society sees yourself, don't really kind of match. And so when you transition, it's so that you are comfortable with who you are, the way in which you see yourself in the mirror, the way in which society sees you as well. You want to fit a particular role that society has already kind of developed as a way of just being able to kind of just do your daily business, really. A lot of it is purely motivated by that real desire to be, in my situation, for example, as a trans woman, I want to be seen in society as a woman. I want to be able to look in the mirror and see myself in the way in which I think I should see myself. And the way in which I deal with that is through transitioning. That involves having various therapies beforehand, making sure that this is a route in which you need to go down, and then taking the medical steps in order to feel more comfortable. Could you just explain what the actual the steps of transitioning are? Because there are there checks of your mental health, and then to ensure that you are actually experiencing gender dysphoria. And actually, I want to ask as well, do you think that process has got better or harder over recent years? And, just how tied up in NHS care is that entire process? So I can only really talk about my route, and I transitioned and started my transition route quite a long time ago now in the terms of, like, you know, political sphere. I mean, 10 years ago, the transitioning steps are very different to what they are now. At the time, I needed a referral from my GP to a psychologist. I had several appointments with them before I was then referred to a gender identity clinic in London. I had 2 appointments with them before I was prescribed hormones, after which, being on hormones for a while, I was then put on a list to have gender reassignment surgery. Following on from the gender reassignment surgery, that was effectively when my care with the NHS ultimately ended. Since then, the other steps that I've taken, including my facial feminization surgery, that was all done through the private route. My understanding now is that a lot of the steps to actually obtain the hormones have been drawn back on. I know when I was transitioning, it was the 2 appointments with the GIC before you could get them. I've now heard that you only need the 1 appointment in order to do so. But then you have very, like, extortionately long waiting times to be seen on the NHS. Like, you can be talking several years. It's one of the reasons why I try and advocate people to go private as much as possible. But all you really need is, you know, just some therapy or anything really, because hormones aren't necessarily going to be the answer for everyone. I do think that there is, however, some pressure on health services to give out hormones and generally, like, medically transition people without a vigorous like, look at what their mental state of being is. You will see a lot of trans activists talking about the demedicalization of being trans, and that in itself is quite concerning. Ultimately, transitioning is a huge step for anyone to take. It's not something that should be taken lightly. I had to undergo therapy and really had to think about it for years before I was able to come to what I would say is the right conclusion. I started my transition 10 years ago. I've never been happier than I am now. And I can say full on that transitioning was the right course of action for me. But the concern now is that we're seeing, with record numbers going through the gender identity clinics, with massive backlogs of, like, up to several thousand at times, and pressure from activists to make sure that you are prescribing hormones, giving those treatments.
Well, we're going to come on to the activist point. Debbie, do you have anything to add on the point of, is it easier or harder to actually go through the process in 2020?
I think one of the things which has changed is the conflation of lots of different ideas. So there's social transition, which allows people to present themselves as they feel comfortable in society, and then there's medical transition, and we put the whole 2 things together. One thing that is missing in the whole issue, the one thing that's completely missing, is provision of counselling and psychotherapy. When we're talking about NHS provision, the wait lists are enormous. That it's a disgrace, but hormones are relatively cheap. Gender surgery itself is expensive, but it's a one-off cost, and the waiting lists actually keep a cap on the expense there. But what's missing is counselling and psychotherapy. People are going into this without much idea of why they're going into it and what they need out of this, and are being sometimes being led by the opinions of others rather than what they need for themselves. But mental health services, counselling is very expensive, and it's the area of the NHS which has struggled to get funding.
Rose, I'm going to bring you back in then on that point, on to what extent do you believe that the current set of, more vocal perhaps, trans activists represent you and your views in public discourse?
So they don't represent me at all. And I have, just to kind of summarise a little bit about what my YouTube channel is about and the reason why it was set up, because it will help explain this answer. I set up my YouTube channel because I have a huge issue with identity politics and movements which claim to speak on behalf of an entire group of people without really being held to account by said group of people. Anyone who starts off a status by saying something like trans people want this, trans people want that, they are being inherently misleading. And I find people people like that a huge problem, because they claim to speak on behalf of me, and they have people within positions of influence ultimately listening to them, rather than taking into account the plethora of different opinions that make up this so-called trans community. Now, I found the wave in which a lot of these activists talking about us and putting forward what our views on this are to be, like, at times incredibly dangerous and inherently detrimental to what we want. And the demedicalization of being a transsexual, combined with the way in which more and more identities are being moved within this trans umbrella, which used to basically just be transsexuals, but now covers everything from cross-dressers, transvestites, drag kings and queens. Some people will try and push in butch lesbians or feminine gay men in there, non-binary identities, gender fluid. You end up with a very diluted pool of opinions in this community. And as a result of that, there is no kind of clear message on what it is that we need at all. We seem to be pulling from this pool, which are only interested in, like, just effectively getting people to, like, validate their identities. Like, there's a lot of a push of validation. And that's the way they seem to see some of the medical process as well, just a way of them being more valid, when it should never really be about validity. It's about making sure that you get the help that you need. And I agree with Debbie completely that there isn't enough counselling in there to make sure that people who are going through this big step are actually making sure that they're doing it for the right reasons. And there's a lot of outside influence that's telling people that they are trans, and they ultimately aren't. And this is why we're seeing so many people going through this process now. And one of the big fears is that in a couple of years, we're going to have a huge wave of detransitioners. Ultimately, that will reflect badly on people like myself, because we'll then be jumped in with them as well, because everyone groups people into groups, whether you like it or not.
Mm-hmm. Debbie, are you represented by the modern sort of trans activists?
The problem with mainstream trans activism is the actual focus of it. I've sometimes explained it in terms of there's two verbs: there's to do and to be. And what activism should be doing is protect our rights to do things. So in terms of gay rights, it was to get married, it was to have the age of be able to have sexual relations with people in the same ages as heterosexual people could. It's about doing things. So from trans rights, what I'm looking for is the right of people to do things, the right of people to present themselves in the same way as somebody of the opposite sex and not get sacked from their job. The right for people to the provision of goods and services, to access those things. But that's not what we hear from mainstream trans activism. It's all about being things. Well, I don't need any rights to be things. I am myself. But what's happening is that the way in which identity is taking over everything is actually it's not giving us freedoms. It's actually restricting us, because it's saying to be trans, you've got to identify like this, and this is the sort of things that trans people do. No, this is the sort of thing that trans people are. I want to keep the focus on what we're allowed to do.
Rose, I want to ask, what do you think about the work of people like Jessica Yaniv? I hope I'm pronouncing that right. A trans woman with male genitalia who has attempted lawsuits arguing that a handful of beauticians have discriminated against her when they denied waxing services. Is that helpful to the cause?
Just to preface this, you're going to probably end up with a lot of ContraPoints fans watching this video and will instantly rail on me for even mentioning Jessica Yaniv. But Yaniv is a very important individual to talk about. The reason being that Yaniv, as a person, is someone who is dangerous, is someone who is very unhinged. But the issue with Yaniv isn't necessarily that he is a creep. The issue with Yaniv is that he's been able to use the kinds of policies which are pushed by trans activists in order to get to the kind of position that he's in now. As an example, the famous ball waxing case, which is really what put Yaniv on the world map, involved the idea about female genitals can be testicles. One of the lines you'll often hear being pushed from trans activists is that sex is a social construct, and that, a woman can be a woman even if they have a penis and a beard. And because of that kind of lack of distinction, and then there being the idea of a women's penis, women's testicles, and that therefore being women's genitals, Yaniv was able to use that to take forward cases in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, saying that he was discriminated against because he is a woman. By the definition that the trans activists push, he is a woman, and that his genitals are therefore female genitals. So refusing to wax them is an act of transphobia. And it's the reason why the likes of Yaniv are important to talk about, because it is an extreme example, but you wouldn't have the likes of Jessica Yaniv were it not for the radical policies being pushed that allow such dangerous individuals to get in by the back door. This doesn't mean that trans activism is being pushed with a morally dubious intent to allow people like Yaniv to exist, but they refuse to even acknowledge that the likes of Yaniv can get away with it. You'll often hear arguments about, say, trans prisoners being another example, where women, they will say that like trans people wouldn't rape, a trans person would never rape, but that can still happen, and it does. And Karen White is probably the biggest example in the UK. That doesn't mean that trans people... Could you just
explain who Karen White was?
So Karen White was a paedophile and basically was arrested and I think jailed in 2017 after breaking into someone's house and stabbing them. Because Karen decided to self-ID as a woman, somehow he was able to be sent to a women's prison in Leeds where he sexually assaulted 2 of the inmates. After that, he was moved to a male prison, but I do believe that he was still trying to push to get back into a women's prison at some point. You end up getting people like that when you basically have an open border on gender, where anyone can self-identify as whatever they like, and you have to take it seriously. That without any kind of criteria, you allow it to be open up to abuse. Now, you can have a discussion on what that criteria should involve, but that's not what the debate really is. The debate is simply simply anarchy on identity. And as a result of that, you erode whatever kind of rights there are for particular identities. It's why one of the big kind of debates in the UK, at least on trans issues, is kind of like the fight between the radical feminists and the trans activists, because both of them have an idea of what a woman is, but one of them is a lot more open to interpretation than the other.
Well, we'll come back to that. Debbie, I want to ask you, though, I was scrolling through my Twitter feed this morning, as I do quite often, and I think it's the owner of Attitude magazine, but I could have that wrong, wants to fundraise so that trans activists can declare a 14-year-old girl a vexatious litigant so she can be legally sanctioned because she's prepared to take legal action to ensure she doesn't have to share changing rooms with boys. It's these sorts of moves from, I think, the more activist class that I think are actually causing people to become quite fearful of where this could end up.
Well, yeah, I was actually quite shocked by it, and I've been in this debate for quite some time. It wasn't the background is there is a 14-year-old girl bringing a case that she wants her sex-based rights to be protected. That means, as a girl, she has a right to sex-segregated facilities in schools. So the case is due to come to court, and we're in a situation where middle-aged men are seriously considering taking action against a 14-year-old girl for protecting her sex-based rights. It's quite shocking, really. Now, these people themselves are not trans, but they're there trying to say they're defending the rights of trans people like me and like Rose. Yet we're here, both of us, I'll speak for myself, Rose can speak for herself. We're both here saying that we don't want this. We don't want this support at all. So what is the motivation? Appear to me to be protecting trans people. It's something else, and I don't want any part of that.
Rose, what would you like to happen in public policy terms then, thinking about that debate in particular? For you, is this about access to single sex spaces? Do you recognise why there's resistance from some women to the boundaries of those single sex spaces being made more porous and accessible?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, I can't think of anything in law that forbids me from being able to do whatever I want. I can get a job, I can get housing, I am able to use things such as bathrooms, like of the way in which I present. Like there's nothing within the law at the moment that really needs to be fought for when it comes to trans rights. And it is kind of telling that you have a lot of the LGBT lobby pushing for, like, you know, further funding when effectively all the legal battles have already been won. Like, there hasn't been any need to have any further legal battles since same-sex marriage back in 2013. And so it is, and with Debbie, that it is quite telling that a lot of these activists are almost looking like ways of just being able to prove their relevance. And I do think that there is something there. There are, I understand a lot of the concerns from the radical feminist lobby, and I think that does need to be addressed by both sides. When you allow anyone to enter any kind of, you know, segregated space, you effectively remove the idea that that space exists in the first place. It is fair to acknowledge that that doesn't mean that every single person is completely unhappy with the fact that trans women can use bathrooms. But at the same time, you can still acknowledge that, yeah, there are people who aren't going to be happy with it. And I consider part of a successful transition being someone who could ultimately enter a space such as, for example, a bathroom and not make people comfortable by doing that. When you have the activists who are looking at completely redefining what a woman is, a big example being Alex Drummond, a bearded lesbian who hasn't taken any kind of medical transition, who is looking at redefining what the idea of what a lesbian is. When you have someone like that entering a bathroom, you can completely understand why people would be thinking this is going a little bit too far now. Like, why do we have someone who is claiming to be us when is clearly isn't in any way, shape or form?
Debbie, I'll let you come back in on that, but also could I ask you the question of, or your opinion of, do you think pre-operative and post-operative trans women should be treated differently in public policy terms in access to, if we're talking about access to single-sex spaces?
I think it's which single-sex spaces you need, because sometimes it's clear what surgical procedures you've had done, and it's clear, and sometimes it's not. The difficulty for women is, how do they know the difference? And can they assume that the person who has had surgery is safe and the person who has not had surgery is not safe? They can't. And we're left in a position where, essentially, over the last 5 years, we've moved from a situation where a trans woman was somebody who had gone through some sort of process to anybody who says there's a trans woman. And the only way that women have now of protecting their spaces and having confidence in the spaces after a result of this activism over the last 5 years is to exclude us all, to exclude me and exclude Rose and everybody else. And I have sympathy with that position.
Rose?
I don't like that kind of position because it's very absolute. And it completely removes any kind of nuance in the position. Just because there can be people who identify as trans that are dangerous doesn't mean that all of us therefore pose a danger. And one of my biggest problems with that line of thinking is the people who follow it are very selective in the way in which they put that across. Like, you wouldn't use similar kind of statistics against any other kind of group, but I do think that Debbie kind of has a point where when anyone can enter any kind of space, there are going to be people who have concerns. Both things can still be true. You can still have concerns about it, and it's not transphobic to say that, well, actually, maybe I don't feel safe. Like, that is a fair enough position for people to go to. I would disagree that should mean that we should all therefore be excluded by definition. But I think that acknowledging the fact that people do have these thoughts is the way in which you progress this debate. When you start shutting down that kind of view and saying, well, no, you are a bigot for not being comfortable with this trans woman in this space, then all that's going to end up doing is, like, they're going to double down on their position. They're not going to question it. They're not going to wonder about any kind of nuance, because instantly they're just being attacked. It's one of the biggest problems with this debate is that the subject of trans issues are so sensitive. Any kind of questioning of it can get you branded as being a bigot. Like, and I've seen this happen to so many people, including well-meaning people. You even see it with trans activists themselves. Hell, I remember I mentioned ContraPoints earlier. A couple of months ago, she made a comment about how this idea of asking for pronouns is quite a ridiculous thing to make, because for a lot of people, like, using myself as an example, it's obvious what pronouns that we use, but that was seen as being transphobic and discriminatory against non-binary people. As a result of that, she's effectively forced off Twitter. So not even trans activists are safe from that kind of like totalitarian mindset of you have to think in a certain way. And for a lot of the people who think, no, they're not going to get me because I'm a good ally, wait until you say something that's just a little bit unpopular.
Well, exactly.
And they will come for you so hard.
And the goalposts keep being changed, don't they?
Yes.
What isn't acceptable, and the parameters around what isn't acceptable speech is becoming more and more narrow. That it's, I'm finding it hard to navigate through it, and I'm someone who genuinely, and I can say this with my hand on my heart, is absolutely delighted that both of you have your rights protected in law and are protected in law and can live your lives happy as trans women in the way in which you want. That to me is an absolutely fantastic feat of society and lawmaking. But I'm really worried by, if you dare, which I have done in the past, I've said that, biological sex is an immutable fact. I've said that I think removing women from the Equality Act of 2010 would be an act of lunacy. That makes me a transphobe.
And that's it. A lot of people are getting branded by it. And it is interesting when you actually listen to the kind of rhetoric that's coming out, where they will brand anyone who has these particular views as being inherently right-wing. And whenever they say right-wing, these people mean bad. Because they don't actually understand what the right is. They don't understand anything about the arguments of liberty that we have on the right and hold very dear. I mean, the idea of liberty is probably is my most important value. They want to just be able to control, though. It's entirely totalitarian, the way in which a lot of these are coming off. And it's becoming incredibly frustrating to even kind of have this debate.
Debbie, have you noticed this? As someone on the left, have you noticed this sort of activism?
Well, I find it quite peculiar and bizarre. As a socialist, my politics are based on material reality. We're here to protect people from oppression. That's what we do in politics. We're there to build a better society, and that has to come for helping people out of oppression. But what identity politics suggests almost is that you can identify out of that oppression. Marx would be having a fit at this if he could see what's going on. This is not left-wing politics at all.
What's interesting on that point, when you say you can't identify your way out of oppression, that's not quite what's happening, though, because when they take on these further identities, let's say you have a biological cis woman who comes out as being a trans man, they will no longer argue that, no, I'm not being oppressed anymore because I'm a man. They'll add an additional layer of oppression onto it and say, well, now I am trans man, or I am non-binary, which isn't recognized as much, so therefore I'm being more oppressed. They still build onto that kind of pyramid rather than simply saying, well, I'm not oppressed anymore. And it's the same kind of thing with trans women and gay men. I've seen a lot of arguments on the radfem side saying that a lot of trans women are basically just gay men because we don't want to be associated with the oppression of gay men. But it's only in the last few years that the NUS actually got rid of having any kind of gay representative for their LGBTQIA+++.
Well, we're going to come on to that question. So I think you'll be able to explore that a little bit more in a sec. But
okay.
Debbie, can I just ask you, first of all, before we go on to that, the line that trans women are women doesn't seem to help many, I think, more of the heated policy debates, especially around, which we mentioned earlier, female prison debates, and indeed actually around the Olympics. Should trans women who have undergone male puberty, for example, be eligible to compete against other female athletes on equal terms? And I think I should probably preface that by saying, if we take into consideration, is it Caster Semenya? Is that she was an intersex woman who represents obviously a very, very, very small set of people and athletes it was a tragic case where she was ruled not to be able to compete, but then I think she was brought back in later on. But that's a very, very small set of people. What's your overall view of, if we go back past the, what I consider to be quite a nebulous remark, trans women are women, right, okay, but I want to know what that means in policy terms.
Can I just pick up on the sport?
Yes.
Trans women have no place in female sport because we're not female. You know, that shouldn't be a point that we need to go any further on. You mentioned Caster Semenya. That unfortunately, now we're bringing into the let's bring in the intersex people into the debate as some sort of way of defending an argument. Caster Semenya has a diagnosable intersex condition, and policy needs to be made completely separately for intersex people. It's nothing to do with trans. But the conflation of intersex and trans being a form of intersex, and the nonsense that some people talk about on that line, has been a disaster for people like Caster and for other intersex people.
Rose, do you agree with that?
I agree with Debbie. I think that it's strange how the trans activists, or gender radicals as I would call them, have kind of co-opted intersex as a part of their own umbrella without, again, intersex is something which has been around for a very long time. It's something which I think a lot of them don't quite understand themselves. Like, it isn't this point that there are like multiple different sexes, like there are multiple different genders. But they seem to kind of think that it's one and the same. And with the likes of the South African athlete, she is intersex. It was very unfortunate what had happened to her. I do agree with Debbie that ultimately sport isn't a place for trans women, because even a lot of the ones who are competing, like, in order for it to be any kind of level playing field, they would need to have transitioned at an incredibly early age. And even then, I'm not convinced that they might not have any kind of disadvantage.
Debbie, we've had conversations about this in the past, and I know it's something you're deeply passionate and troubled by. I wonder if you can explain why you've got such deep-rooted reservations about the Mermaids charity, which has come in under quite a lot of scrutiny over recent years. Many children are uncomfortable in their bodies as teenagers, aren't they? And hell, isn't that what puberty is all about? But especially lesbian, gay and bisexual teens who might be coming to terms with a mixture of feelings, should it be made easier or harder to transition at that stage? What do you think the barriers should be in place, and how should parents be involved? Because obviously Mermaids has a pretty clear, radical view on that. I want to hear yours, Debbie.
Well, Mermaid's line is that gender identity trumps sex completely, so that we are the gender identity we think we are, and not the sex which our bodies are. As such, children from a very young age who are involved with such groups pick up that message that they can actually choose their sex and choose their entire future. They're told that it's equivalent. If they choose to grow up as a woman, they can choose to grow up as a woman. If they can choose to grow up as a man, they choose to grow up as a man. Now, as adults, we know that's nonsense. We know that biological sex actually exists. It's real. If we if we grow to maturity, then because of our sex, we can have children of our own. Some of the children that we're talking about here are preschool, primary school. Some of these children believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. They do genuinely believe that they will be able to change their sex. They're being misled and they're being fooled by this. And adults are driving this, and we're in danger of. We're in danger of persuading these children that they can do this, they will do this, and leaving them in a position where they are medicalised for life, they are sterile, they may not have any sexual function, their puberty may be delayed, which delays of physical maturation. We're talking about the impact on their bone structures because they develop during puberty. We're also talking about impact on their mental processes. As a teacher, I see how children's mental abilities increase during puberty in the same way that their physical bodies develop. all this is being put at risk for these children. They only live once, and by conducting this uncontrolled and reckless experiment on these children, we're risking ruining the lives that these children have, and they only get one shot at this.
But what should be the barriers in place, Debbie? What do you think actually should be the rules?
Well, one of the restrictions on me as a child was on gender expression. I've sometimes said that I couldn't cope with society's expectations on me, that I had to express myself as boys did. Actually, the more I think about it, the more I think that was actually in myself. It was the expectations I had on myself at that point. Children that age need to be. Well, they don't need to be, but it would benefit them from being encouraged that they can be the people they want to be, and they don't need to pretend to be the opposite sex in which to do that. So children should be able to express themselves freely. Boys, yes, should be able to wear dresses. Girls should be able to climb trees. But actually, when I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s, that wasn't such a problem as it is today. That's got worse. What we shouldn't be saying to children is, unless you make irreversible decisions about your physical bodies now, you'll not be able to be those people in adulthood. That's what children are being told, and that's what's wrong.
Rose, can I get your opinion on Mermaids? First of all, tell us what you think about the charity, and then explain to me, well, one, whether you agree with their platform, and secondly, what barriers should be in place as far as children are concerned.
Mermaids is one of these charities that, on the face of it, for people who haven't really looked into them, do seem quite nice and friendly. They are there to help up and support young trans people who go through a lot of difficulties, and your average person might look at that and think, like, yes, that's absolutely a valid cause. But as Debbie said, they put very much a focus on your identity above all else. And from what I've seen, the kind of work in which they do, it doesn't sound like they would actually look at whether or not any of these families of these children who are coming to them, whether the children actually have gender dysphoria or not. It seems to be that, well, they identify as this way, right, let's make that happen at an early age, and the earlier the better. This causes a lot of problems, and I don't see them ever having the guts to stand up against this trans lobby, which they've helped create, because they will get torn down. I think that they are quite redundant in regards to the actual advancement of trans people. Now, on the subject of trans children, I think that is it's a subject which is quite close to my heart, because I grew up with gender dysphoria, and I know that had transitioning been an option for me at a very young age, I would have taken it. And from the way in which I am now, I know I would have been happy. The problem that I have with this, though, is that I only know this in retrospect. I wouldn't necessarily know this at the time in which I am, like 10 or 12 years old. Now, there are examples of people who have transitioned very young and have actually gone on to live full lives and are clearly comfortable with the route in which they have taken. Blair White did a video last night where she talked to an 18-year-old who actually started transitioning socially at the age of 10 and went on hormone blockers at the age of 12. But that should be prefaced by saying that all happened in a different political time. At the time, there was very few young trans people that were even seeking any kind of medical help. Like, it'd be like around 30 or 40. But now we're talking about thousands. All of this has come completely out of the blue over the last couple of years. And whilst we can have a look at some people who absolutely medically transitioning young was beneficial to them, there are a lot of people where it's such a grey case. And I do agree with Debbie that a lot of them do seem to be getting outside influence that is effectively making them go through an incredibly serious route that they're not going to fully comprehend. It's a very difficult situation, and it's something which I definitely err on the side of not starting any kind of hormones until they're older. I would probably say the absolute youngest for me would be about 16. But even then, I know that you're not going to always get that right 100% of the time. And the younger that you go, the more likely it is that you're probably going to get that wrong, and the more impact that's going to do on that person that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. And this seems to be happening more disproportionately with females who are transitioning to either men or medically transitioning to non-binary identities, which does happen, than the other way around. And that's something which needs to be noted as well. A lot of the referrals nowadays are coming from more from females as opposed to males. I don't like the idea of fully saying that there is, none of these people should get any kind of treatment. And it would be hypocritical for me to say, no, they don't know what they wanted, when at that age, looking back, I kind of know that I did.
From the data that I've seen, it does seem to suggest that a lot of people who are experiencing gender dysphoria during adolescence go on to live quite happy lives as either lesbian, gay or bisexual men or women.
Yeah.
Do you think, am I being too calculated? Yeah.
No, I've had a look at a lot of studies as well, and whilst there's nothing that I think is 100% conclusive one way or another, there have definitely been studies that have noted that a lot of people who were, say, considered to be trans at a young age eventually just became gay or did absolutely nothing else and just ended up being straight. These are things which can and do happen, and that developmental time is something which is very important. You can always change the view on it. It's why it's such a difficult call. I think it's a difficult call for a lot of people. I'm not always happy with kind of absolutes. It's why I'm not necessarily happy with kind of government recent calls to say only over 18s can transition. But that's just kind of my own views on my own ideals more than anything. I do acknowledge though that for a lot of people it could indeed be dangerous. The problem from the trans lobby or the gender radicals is that they don't really acknowledge that nuance.
And what you mentioned earlier, where you might have this rush of people detransitioning in the not too distant future, that could be exacerbated by a liberalisation of the rules and the barriers.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Debbie, is a trans woman who is attracted to another woman a lesbian? And how should we think about the interplay of sexuality and gender identity? Is it a mistake, do you think, to put the T into LGBT, given some are statements about sexuality and others are statements about gender? What's your view on that?
Let's go back to what you said about lesbians first. Sexual orientation, the key three letters in sexual orientation is the first three, it's sex. So that lesbians are female people who are sexually attracted to other female people. So as such, trans women can't be lesbians, no. On to putting the T into the LGB and putting it all together. As groups, as LGBT people and as T people, we do face suppression in society, and often it comes from the same sort of people. It's the same sort of people that oppress women and anybody who's different to them, to be honest. And we are stronger when we find common cause. But having said that, our objectives are sometimes different, and we need to respect each other's objectives in that and not actually dominate. We look at the LGBT, and I guess a case in point is Stonewall. For 26 years, Stonewall had nothing to do with trans people at all. They had no interest in us. They dismissed us as a group that was not important to them and their policy objectives. Over the last 5 years, Stonewall don't seem to care much about LGBT people. Their output is constantly on the T, and that's the problem of conflating the two groups. One group will dominate the others. So as groups, we must campaign together and alongside each other, and we're stronger alongside each other, but we need to protect our own identities within that campaigning structure.
Rose, where do you stand on this? Because I personally, I don't think it should be grouped together, and that's not because I don't have sympathy and compassion towards the T. It's just that I don't know what it's like to experiencing gender dysphoria. I don't know what trans men and women need as far as policy is concerned. Where do you stand?
I am probably more against the T being grouped in. The reason for it is, as Debbie said, there are two different kind of end goals here, and one's about sexuality, the other one is about gender identity. These aren't necessarily linked. And I think that I can see the kind of historical reason why they were grouped in together seems to be mostly about kind of societal oppressions and people not noticing the difference between, say, like a trans person and a gay man. But we have moved on a lot since then. Society has moved on. And I think it is fair to acknowledge that maybe there are, like, you know, it's time to kind of cut ties and everyone goes off and does their own thing. I mean, I am someone who thinks that the trans community should really only be focused on transsexuals, and I'm very much against this broadening of the spectrum. And that broadening of the spectrum is definitely happening on the LGB side, as you have more and more kind of weird and wonderful identities being pushed into it that have absolutely no kind of correlation with anything else. When you dilute your message too much, when everything becomes too intersectional, you lose sight of what your original aim was. I think that if you're going to set up these kinds of groups, you should have your aim and then fight for that corner, rather than spread it out and ultimately kind of lose sight of what you were fighting for in the first place. And that seems to definitely be happening on the LGBT side. Having said that, I do kind of question what the need for likes of Stonewall is now that we have for legal equality. Like Stonewall, I do believe personally that Stonewall have pushed for trans issues so hard simply because once same-sex marriage was enshrined in law, they effectively had no more legal battles to fight. But there was the trans lobby who has been, you know, wanting to gain more and more power, and I'm still not really sure what the trans lobby is actually, you know, what they can reasonably gain. But it looks like a fight, and it's certainly been financially beneficial for Stonewall at the very least, because they've been able to maintain quite a lot of funding over the last couple of years. So they are kind of getting something out of it. That's
a really good point. Debbie, to end, could I ask you to summarise how, with the government now making clear it will not back self-identification reforms and putting in place further rules when it comes to child hormones, etc., what would you like to see from the overall debate on trans issues moving forward in policy terms, and both by the trans activist movement and I guess the political class in general?
I'd like to see some clarity. There's been too many assumptions made and too much fudge. Too many people assuming things that are going on rather than what's actually happening. I'd like to see clarity so that trans people are protected in law against discrimination, harassment, etc. Women are also protected in law. Their rights are clearly marked out as well, with some discussion and some policy that best takes that forwards. For the past few years, everybody's assumed something different, and we can't carry on like this. We need clarity.
Rose?
I agree that the government should be scrapping self-ID. I think that it was a particularly bad move. I think that it's fine for there to be specific rules about being able to gain access to these kinds of spaces and not have it as a complete free-for-all. A lot of people aren't really so much applying for the Gender Recognition Act, like certificates, mostly because they have no real need to. I mean, you can get a passport with your like new gender on it without that need. You can get a new driver's license. It's not really the kind of thing that a lot of people are going for. To be able to just kind of open it up too much is just allowing people to, you know, put in the bare minimal effort at all to society, where if you want to be seen in a particular way, you do need to show something to it. And it would effectively just enshrine in law that, you know, a bearded bloke can be a woman. And that in itself causes a lot of problems. So I'm glad they're not really taking it forward. I am incredibly happy with the level that of rights that trans people have in the UK. There is absolutely nothing further that I think that we need. I don't think anything should be taken away. I'm perfectly happy with the Gender Recognition Act as it is. I think that, as Debbie said, we should be protected from discrimination in law. That's fine. But I ultimately think that at this point, it is people demanding more, and they're demanding more from everyone else. They're not looking for kind of individual responsibility, but they seem to want to put it on everyone else to do all the hard work for them. And the more they get that kind of action enshrined in law, the more dangerous that is, and the more dangerous that is for, well, groups such as women.
Mm-hmm. Well, both of you, thank you very much for joining me today. That was absolutely brilliant, and I reckon shone a lot of light on this issue that has been shrouded in darkness and mystery for too long, because a lot of people have been trying to shut down us having this debate. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. I thought that was an absolutely fantastic discussion, and I hope you both have a fantastic rest of your day.
Well, thank you for having us on.
Reasoned is a grassroots organisation that relies on support from people like yourself who want us to continue producing our free-thinking, high-quality content. You can rest assured whatever you donate, big or small, will be put back into ensuring we win the battle of ideas. Thank you for your support.